Is China expanding south? As reports emerge of a new Chinese naval base in Ushuaia, we'll ask if a still enforced 1980s UK arms embargo has pushed Argentina toward the east. I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, as China's power grows, Beijing is looking ever further abroad to expand its military presence. Most recently, it's reportedly been exploring options in southern Argentina, with plans to build a naval base near the southern resort town of Ushuaia. The French news site Intelligence Online reported a breakthrough was made in November when the Chinese Communist Party in Argentina finalized a deal with local authorities. The Ushuaia base would give China a strategic foothold in the southern hemisphere and control over a critical passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, just across the water from Antarctica. Now, back in the 1970s, it was Argentina who had a formidable army, but its failed attempt to take the Falkland Islands in a brief war with the UK led London to impose an arms embargo that's still in force today. It's hindered Argentina's efforts to modernize its military, and some say it's pushed Buenos Aires closer to China. At the very least, Argentina turned to Beijing for military hardware, although it pulled the plug on the Thunderblock fighters over financing issues. So add that to China's pitch for a military base in Ushuaia, and a leading U.S. Navy think tank says it's time for the U.S. and the U.K. to drop that post-Falklands War security policy in order to hinder China's southern development. Here's a look at what's at play.
China's influence is spreading south, from the Pacific Islands to Africa and now to the southernmost tip of South America, through diplomacy, trade, and foreign direct investment. China is planting its feet firmly in the future of the continent. According to the World Economic Forum, trade between China and South American countries has grown 26-fold in the last 20 years. Investment increased from $12 billion in 2000 to $315 billion in 2020 and is expected to double by 2035 to over $700 billion. China has extended its Belt and Road Initiative to the region, using the vast infrastructure and international cooperation program to expand its sphere of influence. The initiative is considered one of the tools used by Beijing to further its ambition to become a world power.
I believe that, judging from the Belt and Road Cooperation document we signed, we can make bilateral trade more balanced, which is a win-win situation, and this is what we must do. China is helping us achieve this goal.
This expansion has not gone unnoticed. It has been ringing alarm bells in the US. To keep its southern neighbors on side and ensure stability and security, the US hopes to sell F-16 fighters to Argentina, countering China's pitch for a military presence there. But in order to do that, they need the UK's cooperation. After the Falklands War in 1982, the United Kingdom placed a total embargo on military hardware going to Argentina. This has paralyzed Argentina's military capabilities and forced it to look elsewhere for hardware. China willingly stepped up. Now the US is urging Britain to review its policy and allow for a counter-influence. But is it too little, too late?
So is it time for the UK to drop its decades-old arms embargo on Argentina? And to what end? And how far has Argentina's and the region's relationship with China already come? Well, joining me now to debate the many angles to this story are, from Falls Church, Virginia, retired U.S. Army colonel and visiting professor at the College of William and Mary, Lawrence Wilkerson. From London, international security specialist at Loughborough University and former senior officer in the UK Armed Forces, Afzal Ashraf. And from Edinburgh, defense analyst, journalist, and retired UK Army Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. Thanks all so much for being with us. Afzal, I'll start with you, and let's look at this UK arms embargo on Argentina after 40 years now. Why is it still being enforced?
Well, I think it's being enforced because otherwise the 6 million pounds that the UK spends every year at the very least in defending the Falkland Islands will have to increase unless something is done to mitigate the potential threat from Argentina. So essentially, what has to be discussed is if Argentina wants to rebuild its forces, and indeed it has a legitimate right to do so, some form of security guarantee has to be provided to the United Kingdom. Otherwise, its defense against another attack, albeit unlikely after 40 years, that still remains a possibility, and the forces on Mount Pleasant airfield will have to be significantly increased to match whatever update the Argentinian military has in terms of its equipment and force structures.
Unlikely, but still possible. Stuart, I mean, under what circumstances would Argentina actually go after the Falkland Islands again?
Well, I mean, I do agree that it's unlikely, but we have to remember that Argentina still maintains a claim that it should have sovereignty over the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, I think it is. Excuse my dreadful Spanish. And so one has to be prepared for every eventuality. I don't think Argentina is in any way poised to attack, nor do I think it is necessarily planning anything in the foreseeable future. But it definitely, if the rearming of Argentina goes the way that I think the USA is suggesting it might go, with the Danish F-16s being passed over, then that raises the ante slightly. And we also have to remember that the population of the Falkland Islands are all UK citizens, all 3,600 of them, and they have a say in the matter as well. And that's before we go into what I mean, obviously there's a strategic benefit for Britain to be able to have forces and influence in the South Atlantic from the Falkland Islands, but there are also the economic benefits which need to be taken into account as well.
So just to be clear, do you think the arms embargo really is worth keeping exactly as it is?
Well, no, I mean, time has moved on, and we have to draw a line under things, but until such time as Argentina gives some sort of guarantee that it's not going to use arms coming from the USA or elsewhere to attempt to retake the Falklands, then I think we're at a bit of an impasse or a standoff. And it may be that some compromise can be reached whereby the USA will come to an arrangement with the UK whereby it guarantees that any weapons that it does supply to Argentina will not, under any circumstances, be used to at any attempt to take the Falklands.
Okay. Lawrence, give me really your assessment of how you think the UK arms embargo plays into the overall dynamics in the region right now, especially with China's interests in building bases there and having a stronger role in South America.
I think what we just heard from our friend from Edinburgh is accurate, but I would go even further, and I would say that it is well past the time where the diplomatic instrument, which London and Washington have let atrophy to a great degree over the last few years, is used. And I don't see any problem with London working with Buenos Aires, with Washington as backup and support, affecting some kind of security agreement that would solve London's concerns and let Buenos Aires, Argentina in general, get back on some normal track for its military. I think it's long past time for that to occur.
But if it doesn't, if something isn't done to quell the UK's security concerns with Argentina and the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, what's the flip side to that? Because there are, as the US Navy report in particular has said, all of this is helping to collectively push Argentina closer to China. And that serves no Western country's best interest.
Well, that's true. And it's true because the Base Road Initiative, and there are positive aspects to the BRI, it's lifting quite a few people who otherwise wouldn't be lifted out of poverty. There are onerous conditions sometimes that China puts on its aid, but nonetheless, it is a positive overall, I think, and that's something Washington doesn't want to admit to, because Washington can't match it. It's very simple. Washington does not have the money to match it. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the hypocrisy of Washington to go after China for its some 6 or 7 bases in the world, when the U.S. has 750 bases plus in the world. The rest of the world has about 80, so it's kind of preposterous. It's hypocrisy for Washington to be talking about China building bases. At the same time, the one in Tierra del Fuego is a serious move by China. It's a very vulnerable move right now. Were we to go to war, but it's a serious move, and as a military professional, I'm a bit concerned about it. The other bases, I actually, as a military professional, I'm more concerned about China's submarine tending contracts with other countries like Pakistan, because we could take Tierra del Fuego out in a heartbeat. The submarines are another matter altogether. They're very dangerous. So I'm more worried about China's agreements that put its submarines all over the world's oceans.
But I mean, the Ushuaia base doesn't concern you nearly as much then. I mean, do you think it's just an exaggeration on the part of the U.S. military, or do they see something that they think has to be nipped in the bud legitimately?
Can I just
go ahead. Well, actually, yeah, Stuart, go ahead.
U.S. military thinks it has to nip everything in the bud that China does right now, and President Biden seems to go along with it. But as I said, it's highly hypocritical of us to do this. China's in Djibouti. It's understandable. They've been very cooperative with the Combined Task Force in the Red Sea, which is a far more dangerous area than the Straits of Magellan. So this is a double-edged sword here. We get all concerned about this and make all kinds of remonstrances in the world. And I'm not worried about it as a military professional. Tierra del Fuego is a different deal, and we need to treat Argentina better, and some other countries I could name too.
Okay.
But it's not a world changer.
Stuart, go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is, and I don't necessarily disagree with what's been said, but I do think that what's going on here is just another iteration, the next iteration, if you like, in the global competition between the USA and China. Now, I'm not an expert in international relations, but it seems to me that, and I take the point that the US and Britain have got bases all over the world from which they can, influence by soft or hard power. And what they're trying to do, I guess, in the big scheme of things, is prevent China coming in any way into competition with them in all these areas of the world. And Tierra del Fuego is the most recent iteration, and that's why there's a fuss about it.
Because Afzal, what would China having a base in Ushuaia actually mean to the West? What would there be as far as security threats are concerned, if any?
Access to the Antarctic for a start.
I wanted Afzal quickly, and Stuart, I'll come right back to you. Go ahead, Afzal.
What it means is, what's been projected is that it gives China potentially a blocking option, because obviously there's a relatively narrow strip of land, or sea rather, between the southern tip of the South American continent and Antarctica. And there is also a claim that that will provide the Chinese a listening opportunity for local communications, military communications. The point, I think, has been well made that there is a potential threat, but it's got to be seen in the overall context where, Western nations have far more strategically controlling bases across the world, and we can't easily, without risking enormous costs to world security, hold back other nations that want to expand. Now, ultimately, if that happens, it could lead to a confrontation. But I think we're way away from those hypothetical issues. The question really is, why should Argentina be allowed to update its defenses? And what are the motives for that? Well, I think to put this particular conversation into context, the first attempt to rebuild the Argentinian forces was by the United States almost immediately after the reclaiming of the Falkland Islands by the UK, and it was Margaret Thatcher who blocked that. And the reasons I've already explained why the British government feels it wants to have this arms embargo enforced by the United States. But this situation, whatever the motivations with China or aren't, provides a fantastic opportunity because the three sides involved, Argentinians and the British and the Americans, all three have an interest, a common interest, which would allow a negotiated settlement.
And you think a negotiated settlement is really an opportunity because it could actually, one could argue that could lead to further conflict if they can't find an agreement.
No, I think the negotiated
settlement... Well, they'll find an agreement. They'll find an agreement.
Stuart, why are you so sure of that?
Well, I think it's the only option, to be honest. I mean, I think another war over the Falklands is to be avoided at all costs. I think it's unlikely, and I think it's in the USA and the UK's and in Argentina's interest to settle this affair, come to some arrangement over the future of the Falkland Islands, which allows Argentina to rearm through the USA and not necessarily through China, because that's seen again as another part of the expansionist.
We do not.
Lawrence, go ahead.
We do not want to make an enemy of Argentina, and Argentina, Buenos Aires, is far more apt to make an ultimate deal with London and Washington, particularly with Washington, than it is with China. And I would say that part of this movement by Argentina, apparently towards China, is to kind of bring that pressure to bear so that they can get an agreement. Buenos Aires has no desire to be aligned with China and not with the United States. We are financing Argentina right now to a real extent. Everything from BlackRock to Vanguard to State Group. I mean, their whole economy is dependent on what Washington does or doesn't do. They want to be in Washington's camp. They do not want to be in China's camp. They're using this as a way to try and put pressure on Washington to get back in it.
I mean, it has been pointed out that Argentina can barely afford to support its own economy right now. It's in a major crisis. And the idea, they already pulled out of one deal to buy weapons from China, saying that they really had to work on prioritizing their spending in a different way because their own people are suffering. So yeah, there's an economic element to this equation as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the geographical situation down there too. I mean, this preposterous animosity that raises its head sometimes between Chile and Argentina, and to a lesser extent others, that needs to go by the wayside too. I mean, it's easy to say and hard to do, but you would ask yourself, in essence, why does Argentina and why does Chile, for that matter, other countries in South America, need formidable militaries that fly these high, fourth generation, fifth generation fighters and so forth? Okay, they got to do that, but let's tamp it down a little bit, and let's not have the animosity in South America that we do, so that we can deal with the bigger problems in the world.
I think
yes, quickly, Afzal, before I move on to another issue.
I think you've got an agreement between all three of us that this problem can and should be solved. The question really is how. And what I would suggest is, rather than solving it once and for all, which is very difficult to achieve, what can be done is to take Argentina's declaration that it is not going to use military means to recover what it calls Malvinas, build on that by having a 20-year, 25-year agreement of no military intervention by any party, underwritten perhaps by the United States. This will put the issue on ice for a long time. It will allow the United Kingdom to reduce its defense spending in the Falklands. It would allow the Argentinians to get the weapons, because Britain can, in return for that agreement, stop its embargo request on the United States, and it will allow the United States to do what it wants to do, and that is to help Argentina build its forces. And part of that agreement could be a non-aggression pact with Chile as well,
Okay.
underwritten by the United States.
Okay. Stuart, I want to move on with you to another, as I said, there are many angles to this story. And one is the fact that some, mostly the Chinese, see these parallels with the Falkland Islands and Taiwan, because China has tried to shape things in that way, saying the occupation of the Falklands is actually basically the legacy of colonialism. How is that really playing out? Is it a legitimate point to make? I mean, some would call it rich because indigenous Argentinians would remind their leaders today that they are the direct descendants of European colonizers who sometimes continue to marginalize indigenous people.
Yeah, well, there's a bit of a debate around this, and it would seem that many people claim, of course, that the Falklands have never been Argentinian. They may have been French at one point, they may have been Spanish, and the Argentinian claim comes through the accession through the Spanish connection. But Britain established a base there in the 1830s, I think, 1831. There was a bit of fighting over it. The USA got involved way back then and sank a few ships. So whether it's directly comparable with Taiwan, I think, is a difficult one to argue. Again, I don't know if we want to talk in any depth about the Taiwanese situation. On the face of it, it looks similar, but I think the sort of intricacies of it are quite different.
Right. But I mean, Lawrence, we would have to kind of expect China to try to make that point somehow, that, interference in their issues with Taiwan are a bit similar to the UK trying to block the Argentinians from taking the islands that they believe are part of their territorial integrity anyway.
Well, there's no question China will use every opportunity for anything that looks remotely like Taiwan to make that example. I haven't heard Wang Yi or anyone like that of formidable influence in Beijing do that yet, and maybe they have. But let's face things here. All these instances of colonial reference and colonial history are by the wayside in many respects when it comes to global power, and certainly when it comes to the real crisis we confront in the world today, like no nuclear weapons, arms control treaties, and the climate crisis. So we need to get beyond some of this, and as was just said, we need a diplomatic agreement here, and one that lasts for a while. And it needs to take into consideration antagonisms in South America and also across the Atlantic. We need to settle this, and we need to settle it through diplomacy. And this is one of the least intractable problems in the world, as far as I'm concerned. It should be settleable within, say, a year of really practiced diplomacy by London, Washington, and Buenos Aires.
Okay.
And what that does to the Chinese bases is another question altogether, because I agree this one in Tierra del Fuego is being there where it is, Antarctica, the Straits of Magellan, and so forth. It's a very serious geographic effort, if you will, by China to extend its power. It's not one we couldn't take care of, but it is more serious, say, than their presence on Djibouti, even though Djibouti is on the Bab el-Mandeb and one of the most important straits in the world, 60% of the world's commerce.
But when you say quickly, I mean, we only have a minute left. When you say quickly, it's something we can take care of. How do you mean? How do you just take care of that?
If you had to take care of this extension of Chinese power through military means, it wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take much.
Oh, it wouldn't. It wouldn't.
Interesting to hear that.
Not only if the USA is involved.
Go ahead, Stuart. Quick final words. We only have about 45 seconds left.
Yeah, all I'm saying is the one thing I did want to say is I don't think that the Chinese presence in Tierra del Fuego is in any way constitutes a threat to the Falkland Islands. Just if you'd like to square the circle on that one.
What about to the region?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If it was seen as being a strategic and military threat, then it would not be difficult to eliminate it through military means.
Okay.
The other thing the Chinese are thinking about doing and want to do is build a canal in Nicaragua. So if you had Tierra del Fuego and a canal in Nicaragua to take commerce away from the Panama Canal, that would then be serious inroads. So we need to watch that closely too.
Indeed, a lot could still happen. We'll have to follow up with the story in the future. Then I'd like to thank all three of you, though, for filling us in with all your insights. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank our guests and our viewers, of course, for being with us. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's all for now. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.